Hi, this presentation is on the causes of abnormal behavior. This is chapter 2, also unit 2 for Psych 404, psychological disorders. In addition to this video on Canvas, I have included videos that I recorded for my general psychology class that goes into considerable detail about the biological paradigm or the biological model for how we try to understand psychological disorders. Those 3 videos are entitled Dr. DeBord Talks About the Action Potential, Neurotransmission, and the Nervous System. So for more detail, if you need it, refer to that. Otherwise, in this presentation, I will give a very brief presentation on that material. Also, your book talks about it. So the overall chapter, let's see if I can get this thing to move. There we are. Talks about 4 major models or paradigms of how we explain disorders, how we treat them. We think about each one of these having their strengths and weaknesses. As I go through them, you'll understand what each of these phrases mean as a list of terms here. I mean, biological stuff makes sense, but the rest of it may not, may all be new to you. Before launching into the biological model, I do want to talk about the importance of the interactionist perspective. Your book chapter talks about holism and recognizing that a person is more than just a sum of all their parts. So even though I may have some genetic propensity for developing schizophrenia or something like that, it's only when I have an interaction with that genetic propensity with environmental factors, which can contribute to that, can we even begin to understand why a person might develop symptoms of a psychological disorder that's as extreme as schizophrenia. I don't have the genetic background for schizophrenia, but I'm using that as an example. This slide here talks about or tries to demonstrate that people have all sorts of like genetic vulnerabilities or propensities, or what you might call diathesis. That's basically what we're born with. And you can see here in terms of substance abuse, we know there's a genetic contribution to whether a person develops substance abuse disorder in their lifetime. Person 1 here, as you can see, their like genetic vulnerability is higher than person number 2. Then what this illustration is trying to show is if you add environmental stressors to these 2 different people, and one of those stressors might be repeated long-term exposure to like drinking bouts in undergraduate, that the same amount of stress that happened for person 1 is going to put that person over the edge for a diagnosis for substance use disorder. But that same amount of stress in person 2 will not result in a disorder because their genetic vulnerability was so much lower to begin with. So the diathesis stress model is really considering one of the biological backgrounds that can contribute to a person's likelihood for developing a disorder. And then we have to take into consideration the environmental contributions to that. One other thing that I want to mention, we're going to talk a lot about environment and how that can influence disorders, but there are also protective factors. One of the things that has always surprised me from the research literature is that if a person can like survive all sorts and numbers of traumas in their past and their childhood, but if there's one adult that is trustworthy, consistent, regular, stable, that child can lean on, that person has a lot of protection against developing disorders later on in life. So one supportive adult that's consistent and stable can go a long way to preventing all sorts of problems later on. Also, being educated can do it. So being an undergraduate right now is a factor that can protect one from developing disorders, because also you're going to be more informed about how they're treated, what you might do if you see any symptoms being developed in yourself. And socioeconomic status, that's just money. The more money a family has and they can use to pay for treatment and things like that, that's a protective factor as well, obviously. Starting with the biological paradigm, I mentioned that I will go very quickly through this because I have 3 other videos I put on Canvas for this model. We'll talk briefly about neurotransmitters and hormones, the nervous system, and the brain. To begin with, the nervous system is broken down into different parts. You have the central nervous system being the brain and spinal cord going down the whole body. The peripheral nervous system is everything out to the side, including our internal organs and our muscles in our arms, legs, toes, feet, hands. The peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into autonomic and somatic. Somatic is just the voluntary control of your fingers and your arms and legs. The autonomic is more the automatic. And with that comes our survival instincts, basically. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which is what they call the fight or flight. Sometimes they call it fight or flight or flee, because it is what keeps us alive. We're in the middle of a threat. We have all sorts of adrenaline that gets released into our blood system. We have all sorts of neurotransmitters that get released into our nervous system, causing the body to be aroused and prepared to take on a real significant challenge. And that's the sympathetic nervous system that does that, prepares us for fight or flight. When we are at rest and we're relaxed, that gives us an opportunity to switch from the sympathetic nervous system over here to the parasympathetic nervous system. Typically that involves chilling out, digesting food, storing up calories, so that if a challenge comes along later on, you have that stored up in your body. The building blocks of the nervous system include individual neurons. Those are the cells that make up, when you think about an individual neuron, neurons clump together. Typically, that's what we call a nerve. If you cut a nerve in your arm, that's usually a whole bundle of fibers of neurons, and neurons, an individual cell. We have sensory neurons, which take in information from the environment, motor neurons, which make our muscles move, and we have interneurons, which communicates amongst other neurons themselves. The different parts include dendrites, which are structures on this individual nervous system cell, again called the neuron, that picks up messages from other cells so they can send a message to along your whole body. If those dendrites pick up enough chemical signals from other neurons, it will pass a message called the action potential down the length of this entire long tail-like structure called the axon, so that it can then reach the very end of the cell. And these are called end bulbs or synaptic terminals. Inside these are housed chemicals called neurotransmitters, which I'll refer to throughout the semester in this class, because they are a significant portion of how we try to understand psychological disorders, these neurotransmitters, the chemicals housed here. So if this individual nerve cell, called a neuron, receives enough messages from other neurons saying send a message further along the chain of neurons, it will then open up gates which allow that message to be sent all the way down the axon to the end bulb here, or the axon terminal, forcing the release of chemicals into a gap called the synapse between the end bulb and then the dendrites of the next neuron. Once those neurotransmitters are released, they float down across that gap between the two neuron cells. They land on something called a receptor site on that dendrite surface. They chemically attach, they stimulate that postsynaptic cell, or the cell that comes next. That gets released. And if enough of those chemical messages are released on the following cell, the message continues to travel on throughout the entire body, or through even different parts of the brain. Neurotransmitters, as I mentioned here, are chemicals released by one neuron to communicate to another neuron. There are drugs that we call agonists that strengthen that communication process, and some that are called antagonists, which interfere with that communication process between neurons. So we will talk about antidepressants, we'll talk about antipsychotic medication that can either be agonist or antagonist for different neurotransmitters. Some of the way those drugs work that we'll be talking about throughout the semester involves a natural process that occurs in these structures, these two neurons, when an action potential has reached the end and released those neurotransmitters. What happens is those neurotransmitters go once again into the gap called the synapse. They fall into the receptor sites, send a message, and then there's a natural vacuum process called reuptake, and it pulls those neurotransmitters back up to be reused so the messages can be sent again. However, if that vacuum process is shut off, these neurotransmitters, chemical messengers, stay in that gap between neurons, and they repeatedly fall against the receptor sites to send message after message after message. And you might be able to imagine then, if you're trying to affect how neurotransmitters affect symptoms, even symptoms of depression, that by shutting off reuptake of a neurotransmitter like serotonin, that allows more serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, in the synapses of a person with depression, causing repeated and more consistent communication of action potentials to other cells. Typically what we see with antidepressant medication, that helps relieve the symptoms of depression. And that's just talking about one neurotransmitter. And there are a lot that I will refer to throughout the semester. One of the big ones I'll talk about will be dopamine, as you see here, which is a key neurotransmitter in schizophrenia. I just mentioned serotonin right here, which is another neurotransmitter that we know from research that is involved in depression. Let's see. Also, GABA is a powerful family of neurotransmitters, and there are some drugs like alcohol which facilitate the release of additional GABA neurotransmitters into synapses, and that allows for the relief of anxiety symptoms in people. So people who do become addicted to alcohol, frequently what they're trying to do is self-medicate and force the release of additional GABA into their nervous systems so that they have a calming effect on their anxiety symptoms. And it goes back to these neurotransmitters and trying to understand pieces of this very complicated puzzle about why people develop disorders. I'm going to switch briefly here to talking about a couple areas in the brain that I'll refer to throughout the semester. You can see here in this picture that we have the corpus callosum, which is actually that's the part that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. But we also have the cerebral cortex, is what I meant to say here, the outer covering of the brain, which is just that's kind of the human beings like evolved achievement to be able to, I mean, this is what allows us to think critically and perform all the complex behaviors that humans engage in. But we also have other areas of the brain that we share with lower animals that are more primitive. Coming up from the spinal cord, this is basically, you have coming up from the spinal cord, a widening of the brain stem, and then going up into the midbrain, we have what a lot of people call the cave person brain, the animal brain, the emotional brain. All of it is really the limbic system. And even when we're younger, our brains operate more using the limbic system than the cerebral cortex. The limbic system involves structures like the hippocampus, which is a key structure in memory. Also the amygdala, as referred to in a number of disorders, when that is electronically stimulated in human beings, and also animals, you can get very strong like rage responses or very strong fear responses. This amygdala structure in the brain is kind of like an ongoing, almost a assessment of threat to our individual safety, and is frequently active when we're in new situations. So you can imagine a person with post-traumatic stress disorder might have a more active amygdala, constantly on the lookout for threats. Unfortunately, that sends the brain on high alert for people with PTSD on a consistent basis, and it's very difficult for them to focus on other things or then get memories of everyday things like what they just had for breakfast transferred to the hippocampus. Now, most people have, again, operate to some degree with their limbic system as an emotional center, but most of us as human beings also rely on this frontal part of the frontal lobe of the brain, which as we reach our early 20s, mid 20s, has basically strengthened the communications between this part of the brain and the limbic system, which allows us to control our emotions a lot better, or at least to influence them. Control might be a strong word. And make more reasoned decisions, more thoughtful decisions, not just emotional ones. But when a person is a teenager, they're operating mainly on their limbic system. Also, as a teenager, all of us basically had hormone baths in our brain, just intensifying emotional reactions to things. And the communication network between the frontal lobe and the limbic system was not very strong. So a lot of times teenagers make impulsive emotional decisions that many consider not to be adult decisions. And actually, when we get to another disorder like antisocial personality disorder, which allows people to act very impulsively and treat other people like objects and hurt them or even kill them without any regrets, we're talking about problems with this communication network between the frontal lobe and the limbic system, and particularly the amygdala. I'm showing you here with these two slides that we've talked about the neurons that use different sorts of neurotransmitters, but there are pathways of neurons that specialize in communication using serotonin, some specializing in dopamine. We have others that use acetylcholine as another neurotransmitter. But these pathways that have been identified have been very interesting in the research to try to understand things like addiction. I mean, we know this dopamine pathway that has just rich neurons that communicate heavily using dopamine. Anytime we do anything rewarding, this system lights up with release of dopamine and electrical activity of communicating with one another. So if you're listening to your favorite song, talking to your best friend, you get a text from your closest friend, that's going to light up pathways of neurons in the brain that basically becomes our reward system. Along with the biological model, we try to understand psychological disorders in terms of genetic propensities or vulnerabilities. Your book chapter goes on in great detail about this, talking about twin studies, which I encourage you to take a look at. What we know, this is just one bar graph showing that if a person has an identical twin who has schizophrenia, the odds of they themselves developing schizophrenia is about 50-50. That's a lot higher than these other relations, because identical twins, or monozygotic twins is what they're also referred to, share 100% of genetic material. And so if you have an identical twin that develops schizophrenia, the odds of you developing are higher than almost any other likelihood of developing another disorder. And so we know to some degree, because of these types of twin studies, that schizophrenia is at least partially and significantly based in genetics that a person inherits. So I'm going to switch from the biological paradigm to another very popular paradigm or model about how we try to understand psychological disorders. This one was based on the work of Sigmund Freud in the 1800s. He was trained as a physician in Austria and Western Europe. What he found was that he ended up working with patients in his medical practice that were having symptoms that he could find no biological basis for. As he took just thorough case notes on each one of these patients, he started to develop a theory about what was leading to the sorts of symptoms his patients were experiencing. And he found that a lot of time his patients had experienced traumatic events earlier in their lives that then were manifesting biologically in the sorts of symptoms like Anna O, which I referred to, or Bertha Pappenheim in the very first chapter in that video, had what they called glove anesthesia, and she reported that she could not feel anything from the wrist up. But as Freud knew, we knew back then that the hand has nerves coming through the branch here, here, here. And so unless you have your hand cut off, you're not going to have overall anesthesia of the entire hand. It would be like of the thumb or the pinky or the middle fingers, but it wouldn't be, it starts here. It would be, you would have numbness only in certain parts of the hand. And what he found was, as he got patients to talk about their stories and they got some relief in telling about their traumatic histories, they recovered from their physical symptoms. In trying to make sense of this, he developed a theory that included a number of major concepts. One involved what we have here as the conscious awareness that we had, which he said for most human beings did not incorporate much of the personality. This is what they call the iceberg model of human personality that Freud developed. Then we have the preconscious level. Preconscious level is basically anything you can easily access. And that would be if you were to think of your mom's birthday. You weren't actively thinking about that, but you could easily go get that in memory. It's got a preconscious, pull it up. Oh, June 3rd. And then there's the unconscious. And that material is stuff that we've lived through in the past that we've repressed or pushed down, a lot of times because it stimulates anxiety in us. And so what he discovered was having people talk about their traumas, their past history, is that they brought unconscious conflicts that have been repressed or pushed down into conscious awareness. And that resulted in relief of symptoms. He also came up, and you see these other three words here that are associated with his model of human personality. And you may have heard of these before, called the id, ego, and superego. Basically, he came up with a theory that all of us are born basically with this part of our personality, which is all about pleasure. As infants and toddlers, we're all about feed me, let me sleep, make sure I'm dry and warm enough. And it's all about meeting bodily, physical needs. However, because we're often frustrated and we're not always pampered and taken care of as we go from infancy to toddlerhood, our own just infantile minds start to realize, I'm not having all my needs met. I need to basically self-soothe, self-calm, delay my gratification. And what Freud suggested was that was the development of the part of the personality called the ego. And this had to deal with the limitations imposed upon us by reality. You can see it's not a huge part of the personality, but this is the part that operates in consciousness that gives us some choices about what we want to do. But we're often threatened with material that comes up from the unconscious and the id. So we have to use strategies to keep the anxious, the anxiety-provoking, unresolved conflict managed. And by doing that, we use what he called defense mechanisms. You see this third structure here called the superego. And this is a part of the personality that Freud suggested we develop as a way to basically have morals. And he said that when we're roughly in our teenage years or just pre-teenage years, we start to internalize the values, the norms, the rules, what's right and wrong from our families, from our communities, from our schools, from our churches, our synagogues or temples, whatever, that we develop that part. But sometimes people's superego gets overly active, and that can create its own anxiety. This overly moralistic sense of you have to do what's right no matter what can be overwhelming for a person, and that can lead a person to therapy because they're so anxious about their overactive superego. In counseling, the idea for Freud was to make unconscious conflicts more conscious. And the technique he frequently used was he'd have patients lay back. You've probably seen these pictures of patients lounging back on a couch and the therapist saying, okay, open up your mind, tell me any kind of thought, feeling, image that comes through your awareness, and they would sit and take notes on what a patient said. Using those notes, they would come up with their own interpretation of what patterns they were seeing and how that person related to the world, and then come back to the patient and say, I think this is part of your problem. And they would then use interpretations of the patient's patterns to help them understand where their problems originated from. Some of those defense mechanisms that I mentioned, there are some described in your book. There are popular ones of repression. Again, it's the ego trying to protect itself from those unconscious conflicts or impulses coming to awareness when you're not ready for them, or you're trying to study in school or go to work. So repression is pushing things unconscious, but you're using all these defense mechanisms. We all are using these defense mechanisms without conscious thought. They're automatic, they're reflexive, and they do protect us against anxiety. And repression pushes things back down to the unconscious. Denial is another, where a person can be confronted with facts. I mean, for instance, a person can, lose their job because of alcoholism, and lose their license because they had, too many DWIs. And if they say, I don't have a problem with alcohol, that's just flat out denial. Most people are familiar with what denial looks like. Projection is another defense strategy, which is kind of interesting. Or a person has these kind of unconscious parts of their own personality, the way they feel, and they won't accept them, but they put them onto other people. So an example we even talked about in your book, if a person is always angry at their best friend, but instead accuses their best friend of being angry at them, that's projection. They're projecting their own feelings onto the other person and accusing them of having those feelings because they're unacceptable to the original person. There's all sorts that I'd ask you to read about from your chapter. Also, these notes are available on PowerPoint. I'm not going to go through every defense mechanism, but this is one aspect of Freud's theory that survived and that we still use today a lot. I mean, the other parts of his theory we use, and he popularized the idea of the unconscious. He didn't develop it, but because of his popularization of that idea, we talk about that a lot in disorders and in therapy and in treatment. I'm switching gears now to another model, another paradigm in how we try to understand psychological disorders. This is combining both our behaviors and our cognitions. So cognitions are thoughts that we have, and understanding that we have about the world. If you've had general psychology, hopefully you were introduced to these three models of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. I put the dog whisperer in here. Have you ever seen him? He's great with using operant conditioning, reinforcement, rewards, and punishments to train dogs to be better behaved. The same things are used in classrooms. Actually, the same operant conditioning, we are all rewarded and punished by different things. I mean, if you have a burst of dopamine because you just received a text from your significant other, you're being operantly conditioned to check your phone every time you hear that ding on your phone. You're being rewarded, and then you're suddenly going to go to that phone vibrating in your hand or sending off a message about who's texting you. I cannot, go on and on about each one of these models of disorder. As we go through the rest of the chapters, it will become clear that, like, classical conditioning is critical to dealing with anxiety. Because classical conditioning, if you've ever heard of Pavlov's dogs and how they were conditioned to salivate to the sound of a bell, we realize that classical conditioning is about building associations in our mind because of experiences. A lot of times what happens with people with PTSD is that they'll go through a traumatic experience. Let's say they'll be driving when it's raining. And if they have a car accident, the next time they're driving when it's raining, they're likely to have like a panic attack. And that's because that association was like powerful and built into that one traumatic experience. And classical conditioning is about building in strong associations. As I've talked about before, operant conditioning is about rewards and punishments. We know that, if you receive a reward for doing something, you're likely to repeat it again. If you're punished for doing something, you're less likely to do that in the future. Also, we know that if you, let's say you have a phobia of like snakes or dogs or something, that once you get around those things that you fear, you're going to have a lot of anxiety. But what happens for most people is that they are around the thing that they're phobic of, they turn around and just go the other direction. That means the anxiety feelings are going to go away. Um, that is rewarding in its own way. It's called negative reinforcement. But that keeps phobias in place because people do not typically seek treatment for phobias. They just avoid what they're phobic of because it's rewarding to get rid of those anxiety feelings. And that's all part of operant conditioning. Observational learning is probably the easiest model of how we as human beings learn things. And that is we watch other people and we learn from their mistakes. Fortunately, we don't have to learn everything through trial and error. We can watch people in our families, people in our classrooms, and see what they get rewarded and punished for, and it's like decide if we're going to do those same behaviors. One way to try to get rid of anxieties that typically related to phobias like snakes or spiders is instead of having anxiety associated with the thing that we're phobic of, we use something called systematic desensitization. And that means instead of having fear responses to things that you don't like, you have more calm feelings. But that involves a lot of training and meditation, bring your heart rate down, bring your breathing down, and then creating a list of the thing that you're scared of from the least threatening thing that you might associate with that feared object to the most threatening thing. So when it comes to spiders, the example I frequently use in my general psychology class is a crayon drawing of a spider. Probably not going to arouse a lot of anxiety, but if you can stay calm, keep your breathing slow, in the presence of a crayon drawing of a spider, you can move to step 2, which might be a photograph of a spider. Again, if you can stay in the presence of that photograph and keep the breathing slow, your heart rate down, you might go to a video. And systematic desensitization is just about that. You're desensitizing your body in a systematic way to stay calm as you gradually expose yourself to the thing that you fear in higher and higher doses. It's a powerful way to treat phobias. It's something I'll come back to when we talk about anxiety disorders. And this all falls within the cognitive behavioral model or paradigm. Another aspect of the cognitive behavioral model is how we talk to ourselves. As I've mentioned before, I have a part-time therapy practice where a huge part of the work that I do in therapy is trying to understand how people talk to themselves and trying to understand where they heard those messages, challenging those messages because a lot of them are untrue, but they assume that they are true, and trying to replace that kind of negative and self-destructive self-talk with things that are more productive, that are more helpful, that are more realistic, so that they're not entrapped by statements that they heard growing up that, again, may just deplete them of energy and lead to like very low self-esteem or low sense of being effective at anything. The cognitive behavioral model also talks about attributions, how we as human beings explain other people's behaviors or even the world to ourselves. We attribute our depression to this, or we attribute to that. What we know about depression, and those attributions are significant. Your book chapter talks about attributions as well in this model. If we have a negative event happen, let's say that we fail a class. If we make an attribution, so if something goes wrong, that's negative, and we say that sort of thing is stable over time, I'm always failing classes. If we go internal with that attribution, say it's all my fault, I'm the mess up, I'm the reason that happened. And if we then take that negative event and then expand, and not only am I a screw up in school, I'm a screw up in my job, I'm a screw up in my relationships, I'm a bad son or daughter, that's going global with it. And those are patterns of attributions that people who are depressed frequently make. When things go bad, if they make these, what's called, I call them SIG, stable internal global attributions, they're going to stay depressed and probably get like even more depressed. So a lot of the cognitive understanding of depression is like how people explain the world to themselves. And this is where talk therapy comes in as well. How you can get in there and challenge that to change the attributions that people make. The last major model that I wanted to talk about is called humanistic. I have a humanistic therapy. The humanistic paradigm, the humanistic model is a much more difficult one to study. It's more of a philosophy in some ways that says that people are good, that we have free choice, we have free will, that every human being is valuable just because they're a human being, and that every human being aspires to achieve their maximum potential and to self-actualize. Carl Rogers, one of my favorite humanistic psychologists, always compared human beings to plants, that we grow towards light, towards acceptance and love. And that's how human beings grow. So it was a very popular model for understanding human beings in the 1970s. I mean, kind of consistent with almost the hippie philosophy of life. But there's also really valuable material for this in treatment of disorders, because in humanistic model, the paradigm, basically what the idea is that we receive messages as kids that says who we should be, and then we get messages too about like that we're accepted. We have conditions of positive love or positive regard. Only if we meet those conditions will be accepted in our families, by our parents, by our schools. What the humanistic model says is like, you know what? Every person is valuable by themselves, who they are. And that doesn't mean every behavior a person does is acceptable. It's just that as a human being, you are good, valuable, worthwhile, and deserve to be loved. And that's what's called unconditional positive regard. And if you can train a person to have that for themselves, then that person can achieve their ideal. But the more the real and ideal self are separate, the more likely a person is to be anxious, depressed, and have all sorts of problems. So they call that incongruence, a lack of matching between who a person thinks they ought to be and who they think they really are. And the humanistic approach says a lot of that has to come down to a lack of self-acceptance about who you really are, because who you really are is good. Your book chapter goes on to some degree about other factors, including the huge piece of social support that is enormous. That, I mean, having no social support is probably one of the worst things that can happen for a person in terms of developing anxiety, depression, substance abuse, or any other sort of disorder. We also have poverty is a major factor, and this is just a map of like, you can see as the colors get darker, those are the counties in the different states that have higher poverty levels. And there are different ideas. Actually, some argue that poverty can lead to symptoms, because that may lead to more environmental risks of even being exposed to traumas. Others argue that perhaps even developing symptoms of like schizophrenia or things like that may cause a person to lose their job, then not be able to pay their rent, and that it leads to a downward spiral to basically more poverty. So is it that the poverty leads to symptoms, or symptoms lead to poverty, is a question that we'll come back to in this class. Also, what we know in terms of family relations is that kids who are raised in a home with divorce or separation or have more anxiety, more psychological problems. But the question has become there is like, was that due more to the number of arguments and problems and just discord that happens in the family? I mean, it's better to have a warm, supporting environment than anything else. Let's see, what else do I want to point out there? I would encourage you to look at the material in your chapter on attachment theory and on insecure attachments and secure attachments. And I think I will leave that there. Thanks.